and other types of things, soft goods like that. You also, in the Southwest, you have the formative period, as it's called, with the introduction of pottery. And so ceramics become widespread by about 1800 years ago. It is present before late archaic sites, and it overlaps with the introduction of beans. So you get in this formative period, square pit houses tend to be a pretty common form, and you have a variety of village sizes from just one or two all the way up to 25, 35 houses. And you often have storage pits, places to put your excess, your surplus grain, and these can be located both inside and outside the houses, and this implies ownership, of course, which we talked about a little bit in Chapter 7. In Utah, also in Fremont, you see a little bit of regional variation going on. This is from about slightly later, from 700 to 1200 AD. You see that the use of maize is actually fluctuating. Sometimes you have intensive farming, which doesn't result in very high return. So you see rotational farming, probably fallow fields and other types of crops that helps increase yields. And so again, the optimal foraging theory comes back again. And maize agriculture represents a fallback resource farmed in times of need when higher ranked foods are scarce. So agriculture for some communities was an option and not necessarily locked into that. You did then also have some late archaic hunter-gatherers. They were 5,000 to 3,200 years ago, and these hunter-gatherers also practiced some forms of domestication: sunflower, marsh elder, chenopod, and squash. And they also had lots of seafood, which we find shell middens. Shellfish supplies middens in places like Indian Knoll in Kentucky. And in eastern North America, you also get ceramics cropping up at about 5,000 years ago, Stalling Island culture in Georgia. And you also from this get ceremonial objects and ornaments, showing that there actually was long-distance trade. And so it's not just agricultures moving across the landscape. It's not just domesticated plant species moving. It's people, ideas, and communication. And so it's important that we indicate that there's long-distance trade for things like minerals and things that may not be locally available, but you can trade for. And then we start to get to some more sophisticated expressions of culture too. So Pottery Point, Louisiana is a late archaic site, and it has circular embankments, pretty tall, 6.5 feet tall. There's 6 of these circular embankments. It's a kilometer wide, which is about a little more than a half a mile. And we don't really know what these circular embankments were for. It could be domestic. It could be for ceremonial use. It could be the whole site could be ceremonial. Stones were brought from between 450 and 150 miles away, and maybe even farther if it was brought by river. But these are not locally available stones that are found on this site. They're brought in as finished tools or blanks to be used for various tools like points and hoes and knives and fishing nets and sinkers and vessels. And it doesn't seem to follow a down-the-line pattern. That is to say that it seems to be getting things directly from far-away sources and not having more things that are closer by. from closer by. So it's possible that this was a place of congregation, a gathering place, a focal point in the region where many and varied people came together, and maybe that's reflected in why you find things from so far away there. And this could be a monumental construction before villages were formed as a way to negotiate a landscape that was increasingly being contested. If you need territory to survive, if you are investing in agriculture, you need to, and also if you're interacting with hunter-gatherers that are moving through the landscape, you might need a place to negotiate some of these relationships. So this brings us back to these mounds in eastern North America. The Adena and the Hopewell mounds were inhabited between about 3,200 and 1,700 years ago. And the Adena culture corresponds to what we call the early woodland period, and the Hopewell corresponds to what we call the middle woodland period. And both of these cultures constructed mounds and traded extensively over wide areas. They call them the Hopewell, for instance, the Hopewell interaction spheres. The Hopewell settlements in particular had massive earthworks constructed in various shapes. Some of them were just mounded earth, some were circles, squares, octagons. Some put mounds over structures. So there were earlier structures and they built mounds over those. Some have burials laid out to decompose, bundled, then cremated. Some were put in basins, pits, and crushed up. And there are cycles of mounds being built over mounds over mounds. So it's a complex and long process of these mound builder settlements. The exchange network brought exotic goods from long distances, and some of them were crafted objects that were made from exotic materials like copper and mica, and they were sometimes placed into burials. There's some dispute as to whether these mound sites were settlements. Griffin, Lepper, and Yerkes say yes, and Dancy and Pacheco say no, that these were sort of hollow ceremonial centers, and the settlements were elsewhere and have been largely destroyed by modern works and cultivation and that sort of thing. I'll let you read and sort of see the evidence for those arguments. There's, like I said, a difference of opinion, and the evidence is a little bit equivocal in that respect. So I'm not going to come down one way or the other. I'll let you draw your own conclusions from what you read in the book. And so in the woodland periods, you see maize agriculture actually start to be adopted as well. So in addition to trade networks being transporting goods, you also see maize being in the late woodland incorporated into the diet, but it never really becomes a major part of the diet until about 1,000 years ago, when it really becomes a major part of the subsistence strategy. So before maize as a domesticated plant species, you in the woodland periods, you have large settled villages increasing in size, but it's not until much later that you have really more intensive agriculture. And we can tell that it's not just maize being present, but how much it was part of their diet by things like isotope analysis. We find the bones of human remains from the past, and there are some features of maize, actually all plants, are either C3 or C4. Maize is a C4, it's a grass, it's a C4 plant, and if you ingest high quantities of grasses like this, then if that's your diet, you're going to have a higher ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12 in your bone isotopes. And we can measure that even from very distant time periods. So maize we see actually appearing in some of these woodland sites 700 years earlier, then we see this shift to higher ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12. And so even though it was present, we know that the seeds were there. We don't think it was a major part of of the woodland people's diets until 700 years after its introduction. So it was there, it was present, it was part of their trading network, but it wasn't adopted, incorporated into their own subsistence strategy until much later. So the early and middle woodland subsistence seems to be cultivation of indigenously domesticated plants, and maize only appears between 2000 and 1800 years ago. So who are these people that were doing this adoption of domesticated plants? We've been talking about pots, we've been talking about tools, we've been talking about seeds, but what was the culture like? Well, there's a lot we still don't know. And one thing that has, coming back to what we talked about in Chapter 2 in theory, how do you make sense of this? How do you inject some humanity and some people into this? Well, there's no evidence that these were white invaders, Atlanteans, or Bible giants. These were Native American groups, and they organized themselves by their own principles. But one of the things that we should try and remind ourselves of is that actually one of the invisible groups is actually gender. And there's strong ethnographic evidence that selection of plants in hunter-gatherer communities is really directed and led by women in that community. And so it's quite possible that we've just been sort of thinking in terms of who's the leader of this group, and they must be channeling their community towards agriculturalism and hierarchical relationships and monumental earthworks and all that sort of a thing. But actually, it's quite possible that women were leading this by selecting cultigens, types of plants that were more favorable, and they were the active intervention of women is something that could have been a driving force in this. Also, one of the factors that we saw, especially in the Middle East, as to sort of prompting the shift to agriculture in the Middle East was the end of the Ice Age. And it's possible that climate change also had a factor in some of the decisions that were made in North America as well. That climate change could have led to more permanent settlements being developed, and it was perhaps more gradual ecological changes that resulted in domestication in North and Central America that took a much longer time than it did in places like the Middle East. There may have been more optimal zones. And so this could be a very long process that took place. So this is something to keep in mind as well, that the ecology of the Americas is much different from that of the Middle East. There are more broad spectrum diets available than some of the marginal areas in the Holocene in the Middle East, where you had the reduction of grasslands and people concentrating in some of these mega sites, and perhaps prompting a shift more rapidly, even though it was also a process. So that's all I want to talk about in terms of North American domestication. And next time we'll come back and look at Chapter 9. See you then.